Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It can seem almost cruel in this world to criticize something called self-care. After all, don't we deserve that? Isn't it hard enough right now with inflation and political upheaval, tight budgets, and the looming specter of the climate crisis? We need to take care of ourselves. And yeah, we do. But how exactly? What actually makes us feel better? This is not an episode intending to fault you or anyone else for taking time for yourselves, for stepping back and reflecting or taking a deep breath. But it is one that wants you to examine what you're doing when you're doing that. Relaxing with tea and a good book, maybe a phone call or a drink with an old friend, or with an online shopping binge, followed by some doom scrolling alone. Self-care isn't just a behavioral term anymore. It's an industry worth trillions of dollars. And it makes that money when you decide to stay home and pamper yourself in the hopes of feeling better. But is that kind of self-care really making us feel better? Making us happier, less lonely? Or do we need to think again about what self-care really is? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Allie Volpe is a senior reporter for Vox. Hello, Allie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. We're headed into the weekend, so I'm going to go practice some self-care.
What kind of self-care do you practice?
I'm going to take myself out for barbecue. How's that?
Oh, I love that. That's delicious.
This is modern self-care we're talking about, right? Which is just like buying stuff for yourself, I guess?
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just think maybe we should be a little bit skeptical of who is telling us what to buy and who stands to gain from that.
Right. Well, I was fascinated by your piece for Vox, just because I'm always fascinated, I guess, when a definition of something changes so much over the decades. So maybe you can start by just telling us, where did the term self-care come from? And give us some examples of what may have been considered self-care back then.
Yeah. And self-care is definitely one of those terms where the meaning has certainly changed a lot over the decades. Back in the 1950s, it was used in healthcare contexts, to give patients activities they and their families could do so they could better their health, separate from medical professionals, so outside of a medical setting. So it's about staying healthy and dealing with illness as it occurs. So that could be anything from going to the doctor for your yearly checkup or just eating nutritious food. And by the 60s and 70s, self-care came to describe caring for yourself as a political act. The Black Panthers really popularized this, and they stressed the community aspect of care. So they offered free food programs for children and families, free health clinics. And so this definition was by helping your community, you're caring for yourself because we are a collective.
What did Bell Hooks say about it? I found this really interesting.
Yeah. Black feminist writers really sort of popularized this term. Bell Hooks wrote a lot about it. I really like this quote: "Before many of us effectively sustain engagement in organized resistance, struggle, and Black liberation movement, we need to undergo a process of self-recovery that can heal individual wounds that may prevent us from functioning fully." I loved that. And then perhaps most famous of quotes about self-care comes from Audre Lorde. And she had wrote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare." And I feel like I see that quote all the time when I read about the history of self-care. And these are two instances that show how self-care was really meant as a pit stop, not a final destination.
Right. It was, stop and recoup yourself so you can continue the fight.
Exactly. When we are fighting against systems of oppression, we need to take breaks because it's not realistic to sort of be going all the time. And that meaning we lost the plot a little bit.
When did that plot start to twist? When did it begin to move towards what most people would expect when you mention self-care today?
Yeah. So like in the late 1960s and 70s, self-care became more individualized. People started thinking about their personal wellness and this concept of, achieving your quote unquote ever higher potential of functioning. The guy who sort of popularized the idea of wellness had said that. And then into the 80s and through the 2000s, you think about the fitness culture that really emerged and pushed the idea that like we alone are responsible for our health and well-being. Fitness and wellness became this like status symbol. Like you can post pictures of yourself in a boutique fitness class or like showcase products that you've bought and on your social platforms. And like people know a lot about you by those kind of two signals. So this is where we start to see the tides turn. Like wellness isn't something you get from other people. It's something you buy. It's something you show off. And it's often something that you do alone. So by the 2016 election, like you think about everything that was going on in the world around us, like politics, debt, high rent, low pay, burnout. People sort of leaned into this idea of self-care because the world was stressful and crazy. They were trying to find solace wherever they could. And it just so happens there was a healthy market there of skincare products, food delivery, candles, bubble baths, you name it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, I already told you what I'm going to do, but if one of your friends, if you called up one of your friends this afternoon and you said, hey, let's go out tonight and get a few drinks. And they said, actually, today I need to practice self-care. What would you imagine them doing?
Right. I mean, it would probably be a little bit different for each person, but I would imagine they would be doing something alone. Like that is the main thing, like whether it is like going for a walk or it's binging Netflix, all of Bridgerton, or it's taking a bubble bath, whatever it is, like these are things that people are doing alone. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm an introvert. I definitely get a lot of rejuvenation from being by myself. But I also know that what makes me feel better if I'm feeling down is being with other people.
You mentioned that, this twist in what self-care has become is backed by an industry. How big is that industry? How much money is there in self-care and where did that come from?
There's so much money. According to a report last year from the Global Wellness Institute, this global wellness industry is worth $5.6 trillion. And so that includes everything from personal care and beauty, healthy eating, nutrition, weight loss, wellness tourism, gym memberships, and even like public health and medicine. So that is sort of all wrapped up in this multi-trillion-dollar industry.
And just to be clear, like, we're not trying to say that, you mentioned taking time for yourself is not a bad thing. And there's nothing wrong with skin cream or anything. But what are we doing it at the expense of?
Right. Yeah. Like there's nothing wrong with these things. But I think some people may be leaning into these practices at the expense of connecting with other people. I'm sure you've heard a lot about the loneliness epidemic. And so this term has kind of been thrown around for, about the last decade or so. But it really has become popular, I want to say maybe 2015, 2016. And it coincidentally, I feel like that is when the sort of self-care boom was also hitting its peak. So you have a confluence of all these things, like the world sucking, people feeling really bad about it, not knowing what to do to feel better. And then you have like a multitude of products that could potentially help you. A face mask, a bubble bath, a streaming service, any number of things that are being aggressively marketed to people to help calm them in this time of like intense terribleness. But really at the expense of connecting with others. And so I don't think a lot of people maybe thought of like, oh, this self-care practice is isolating. And not to say that like being by yourself means that you are lonely. Like certainly spending time alone does not mean you are lonely. But the more time you do spend alone, the higher the likelihood that you may be lonely. And again, everybody has different levels of how much time they need to spend by themselves. Again, as an introvert, I like to spend probably more time by myself than my best friend, who's definitely an extrovert and spends very little time by herself. So everyone's levels are a little bit different, but the more time we spend alone, the chances are greater that we may feel lonely. And so if you are already lonely and maybe don't realize you're lonely, which is like pretty common, you might just feel down and not realize why, but you might be lonely, but you think like, oh, maybe I just need to like stay in and, watch a movie instead of going to that party that my friend invited me to because I'm just so burned out. And I think we might be confusing ourselves with the right antidote when it should be going to that party.
It's like a vicious cycle, right? Because it can be really hard to get up that energy to go to that party if you're already feeling crummy and you've had the reinforcement of making yourself feel a little less crummy by ordering yourself some takeout or whatever.
Yeah, I know. And it's really hard. And I've certainly been there. Like you finish a rough week at work and you're like, I'm so tired. I'm so burnt out. All I want to do is melt into my couch. And then you open up Instagram and Instagram is like selling you products like a neck massager or a bullet journal. And you're like, oh, these things like seem very nice. Like that could help me with my burnout. Like that could help me better organize my life or make my body feel better. Sure. And then you sort of sink into this routine of like, let me buy this thing to try to make myself feel better, when inevitably the problem is more systemic than your individualized problem. Like we're just trying to put Band-Aids over larger structural issues.
Is this cycle a chicken or the egg thing? Like I'm trying to figure out which came first. Is it us practicing quote unquote self-care and isolating ourselves because we're lonely, or are we lonely because we started to focus too much on ourselves? I realize I'm asking you a very potent philosophical question.
I know. I've been like really noodling on that. Like it's such a good question. I think about the American Time Use survey, which has found like even before the pandemic, Americans were spending more time alone, doing more solitary activities. Again, like watching TV by themselves or doing things on their phones by themselves. So if we are spending more time alone, then perhaps that suggests, we might be feeling more lonely and then trying to fill that void with more isolating practices. Again, like that is just my suspicion. A researcher I talked to made an interesting point that we don't know whether this moment in time people are inherently more lonely than they ever were because there isn't good data to really point back to be like, oh yes, in the 1920s, people were not lonely at all. There's just nothing really to compare to. So it isn't to say that maybe we are lonelier than ever in this current moment. It just is something that people are more aware of, which I think is a wonderful thing. Like we are more aware of the dangers of loneliness. It could be as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It has all these effects on both our mental and physical health. So it isn't to say, again, that we are inherently more lonely and that's why we are looking for these products. So it could just be like, these products exist and that is why we're spending more time alone. Again, I don't think I have a good answer, but it is an excellent question.
On the one hand, I want to just kind of like blame the internet and the availability of everything on our phones for this. But how much of this is the pandemic normalizing isolation? I mean, we all got, whether we liked it or not, we all got very used to, especially people who live on their own, having to be okay with being by ourselves for long periods of time. And, maybe it just doesn't feel weird now to go a whole week without leaving your house.
Yeah, I think it definitely normalized the idea of being alone. But I also know for some people that was very, very painful. And they have rebounded in such a way that they're like, I am never going to be by myself ever again. But then there are certainly some people who are like, okay, well, I'm used to maybe not leaving my house all week and I feel fine and I don't need to do that. And again, if you feel fine, if you do not feel down or lonely like that, you just might need more solitude. But I think it's still important to note that like this researcher, Jeffrey Hall, has this great framework that he calls the social biome. that we need a little bit of everything. We need a little bit of time alone. We need a little bit of time with people we really love. We need a little bit of time with acquaintances. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that we need all of those things in order to be socially healthy. So I think if we're feeling like one bucket is heavier than the others, we might want to get a little bit more balance. But again, if you feel fine, you should not, worry about it.
Getting back to the marketing and monetization of this, how much of how we're feeling is because we're being told that, times are hard and this is miserable and the world is a bad place. So, just spoil yourself. Here's a link.
Yeah, I pointed this out in my piece that the wellness industry would not be as lucrative if it didn't prey on our insecurities. So I think it is a little bit of very good marketing and advertising. And of course, the ease of which we can buy things on our phone. We don't even really need to think about it. But if you're scrolling TikTok and you see a bunch of videos about the 75 hard workout regimen, if you're seeing a bunch of those, you could be oh yeah, why wouldn't I try this? It's very easy to be influenced. Or even your friends being oh my gosh, I tried this new smoothie, this new meal replacement, whatever. And you're yeah, why not? I'll order it right now. But it requires us to feel insecure about something in our lives. And when the world is the way it is, and there's a lot to feel scared or insecure about, it just makes it so easy to buy something to try to fill that void.
Did anybody you spoke to while trying to figure this out offer any tips for breaking that cycle that we were talking about, where you can just feel so bad that you don't feel up to doing anything but practicing self-care, which makes it feel worse? How do you gently care for yourself while still making the connections that will help you on a deeper sense?
Yeah, it's something I've certainly been thinking about a lot in my own personal life as I sort of battle that the pull of the couch on a Friday night. And so I think it's worth really listening to your mind and your body and seeing what it is that you need. And maybe giving yourself a little bit of both. Maybe you do need one night to stay in and recuperate on a weekend, for instance. But then maybe the next night, you do seek out those social connections and see what feels better. And I think just to start paying attention to what it is our bodies are really telling us. If you feel lonely, but you feel you have a lot of friends or people around you, but you don't really feel connected to any of them, that might be a sign you are just looking for that one very deep connection. And maybe you do have that one very deep connection. Maybe you live with a partner or your child, but you still feel this isn't enough. That might be a signal to, maybe go to a coffee shop and just chit chat with some of the people around you, just having those sort of weaker ties, but in a greater abundance. So I think it's kind of just paying attention to what it is we really feel, which can be so hard because you're just feeling something. You're I don't know what this means. So I think it just maybe takes a little bit of trial and error to see what feels good and to definitely not discount doing the thing that might make you feel uncomfortable.
The other thing that I found fascinating that I also wanted to ask about is, I'm sure there are people listening to this right now or people who feel this way that, don't have a ton of friends. And it can be really hard to make those connections depending on where you are in your life. But you don't actually need that. And you just mentioned going to a coffee shop. Obviously, a deeper connection is really important, but just being around people has an impact, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I find that that's one of the easiest things to do. Again, if I'm feeling a little bit disconnected, but low energy, I live near a brewery. I'm so lucky. And I will just, walk down there with a book or my laptop if I have to do some work. And just being around other people, I don't even need to really talk to anyone, but that makes me feel better. That makes me feel connected to my community. And it's such a low energy thing to do. So I would definitely not discount that. For anyone who is, feeling a little burnt out, they're I don't want to talk to people. Just be around people.
And on that note, I'm going to get some barbecue. Allie, thank you so much for this.
Thanks so much for having me.
Allie Volpe reporting for Vox. that was the big story. We have a special themed week coming up for you next week. We decided that after months, probably years of hearing various politicians or experts at various levels of government or policy say that Canada is broken, that we'd actually look at what that means and see what we could do if it is broken to fix it. So next week on The Big Story, a 5-part special, Fixing Canada, looking at various aspects of this country that, whether you think they're broken or not, clearly aren't working as well as they should for Canadians. Focused not on examining who broke it, but on how we can fix it. So I hope you'll tune in for that. We're really looking forward to it. And if you have ideas for any other themed weeks that we should tackle or just any episodes in general, you can always shoot us some feedback. The way to do that is with an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us 416-935-5935. Joe Fish is the lead producer of The Big Story. Robin Simon is also a producer on the show. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Diana Kay is our manager of business development. Mary Jubrin is our audience development lead. Christopher Clark is our sound designer this week and next week. And I'm your host and executive producer, Jordan Heath Rawlings. Together, we're the Frequency Podcast Network, a division of Rogers. Thanks so much for listening to The Big Story. I hope you'll tune in starting Monday for our special week, Fixing Canada. We'll talk then.